So my dad was in prison a lot of my life, especially whenever I was littler. But he always wrote to me. He wrote me birthday cards and letters and just anything I could hold on to, like pictures. He was always drawing for me. But he wrote to my mom, and this is something that he wrote about me that I just wish I could respond to. He said, in general, I love hearing about Sophia. Nothing you write about her is repeated too much, and any smallest detail is welcome. I sadly don't even know her favorite color, her favorite shoes or outfit, her favorite food or her least favorite, who her best friend is, what she's frightened of, or her favorite stuffed animal, or even her favorite bedtime story. I know so little about Sophia, and I want to know everything there is to know about her. I don't want to be her father, I want to be her daddy, her Superman. And that is my favorite thing he has probably ever said.
He told me one time, he said, Mom, I know that the only reason I'm alive is because you pray for me. And he said, please quit praying for me because I don't want to be here anymore.
At first, I was little, so I didn't really understand that it was gonna last forever. I think that I kind of thought, well, it's gonna go away one day. Like, I'm not really gonna have to worry about this. It's whatever. Like, my dad died. It wasn't like a big life change to me like it was for like Amanda or for my grandma. Like, I was having fun. I was out of school. Like, and I was upset, obviously. Like, I was sad that he was dead, but I think that I was so young that I didn't even miss him yet. And so without missing him, I didn't look into the future of like, I'm never gonna see him again. But I would say probably around 7th grade, I really realized, and I started to think about like, nobody's gonna be there to walk me down the aisle, and he's not gonna be there to watch me graduate high school, or he's not gonna meet his grandkids, or he's not gonna be there for me when I start driving and break down on the side of the road, and I can't just call my dad. I can't call my dad. That's not an option. And that was really hard. And I've been through a lot of therapy, and I've been told that I re-grieved him because I was so little. But as I've said, like, he also, after I lost him, I got this. There was no hiding it anymore. There was no hiding that I had addict parents or that, like, what I was going through at home. And so I started to realize that if people are gonna think that it's weird, then maybe I should just make it not weird. And so I started to tell people, and I started to talk to the kids in my class that I knew lived with their grandparents or had addict parents or were in foster care. And I started to talk to the people who had perfect parents and perfect lives. And I started to crack jokes and make people realize that this is a reality and that this happens to the girl you sit next to in math, and it happens to the boy in the hallway, and it happens everywhere, and it doesn't have to be a hush-hush thing.
I'm Bill's mom, Lisa Hayes, and this is my story about my son. Oh, Bill is a kid. I never knew where he was. He'd want to go outside, and I'd say, okay, but you have to stay in the yard. He'd say, okay. Well, next thing you know, I don't know where he's at. I can't find him anywhere. So I might have to look for him for an hour before I found him. And of course, he was always in trouble because the next day he'd do it again. And he was always mischievous and very curious about everything. And he was hard to keep track of. We used to say, where'd Billy go? So much that they called him Billy Goat. So he wasn't very big until about 9 or 10. In middle school, he grew 6 inches. I couldn't keep him in clothes or shoes. He was also then giving clothes and shoes away. I'd have to go to school and find things because he'd get a new coat. The next thing I know, somebody else is wearing it. So he was always concerned about everyone. He had the biggest heart. I often say that his heart was just too soft for this world because he didn't know how to not care for people. He didn't know when to turn it off. He always thought he had best friends, but he never knew their name. Almost like little kids. He had a big imagination, but he'd say, oh, he's my best friend. And I'd say, well, what's his name? Well, I don't know, but we've been hanging out together at school. He's my best friend. I said, okay. He kind of did that as an adult also. He finally learned to ask names so that when I asked him, he could tell me. But he was always very outgoing and embarrassing sometimes, and he embarrassed his sister to pieces. So, yeah, he was something else. Well, he had gotten in trouble he was living with his father because I no longer could handle all of it because I was trying to work and I had another child that was 4 years older. And it got to be, he wanted to go live with his dad. And it was the worst and hardest decision I ever made. But I made it because I thought, well, I can see him every other weekend and I can get him for long periods of time. And then he'll have both because his father wasn't doing that. And I thought, well, he'll get both parents this way because I'll always be there. And then he can live with his dad and go to school. He lived in LaGrange, Kentucky. Twice, he ran away because it wasn't what he thought it was going to be. He thought that his dad had money and he was going to buy him all the newest toys because that's the way he did when he came to visit. And so, when he got there, it wasn't like that at all. And so he ran away. They got him back. I got a call in the middle of the night that he'd run away. Well, when he ran away, he didn't go very far. He just needed to get out of the situation for a minute. And then he'd always come back. But the second time it happened, he went into the Kentucky system. And I couldn't take him back because I couldn't handle him anymore because he was such a man. And so he was in the system till he was 18 years old. And then he wanted to go into the Navy. And so that story is when he got into the Navy and got hurt.
I don't remember necessarily learning that he had an addiction. He was never there. Like, whenever I was little, like, I grew up with my grandma. I grew up without a dad that was, like, that raised me. Like, I knew who he was, and I knew him, and I talked to him, but I knew that he wasn't the person who raised me. Like, I knew that there was something wrong.
And so that story is when he got into the Navy and got hurt. They tried to put him back into boot camp. But from then on, I guess, he had the drug problem. Well, he was pretty good at hiding it for a long time because he was probably just taking pills and stuff. When he started shooting up, I could tell that it had gotten out of control because he was very thin and gaunt looking. And I knew something was going on. Well, after that, it was kind of an uphill battle to keep it. He always had friends. He lost apartments. He lost his car because he let other people drive it. He had several cars, but always somebody else would have wrecks or get caught with drugs or whatever. He did get caught with drugs. They put him in jail. He had a court appearance, and they put him in prison. That was the hardest day of my life. But as it went on, he just got like 18 months, and he got out a little bit early. And I was always there for court. I was one of those tough lovers. So I would support him any way I could, but no money. I'd buy him clothes, I'd buy him shoes, but no money, because I knew what he was going to do with it. And so he did his time, came home, was all healthy looking and everything, and I think probably right away he found his friends again. And he did that. He was in prison 3 times. The other 2 times he was in there for theft, but he had never done his parole all the way, because it would last like 3 years and he couldn't get through it without getting in trouble again. So then he'd have to go back and serve time. And we took Sophia all the time to visit him until he went to a hard prison in Upper Indiana. And I told him, I said, Bill, I'm not doing it anymore. Sophia's getting too big, and they make us feel like criminals to visit. This part of your prison life you're going to have to do alone.
I don't necessarily remember any certain thing. I just know, like, I visited him in prison whenever I was little. Like, I got letters, and I talked to him on the phone, and so I knew that he was in trouble, and I knew that there were bad things going on, so I didn't necessarily ever have to wonder. I always just knew. Whenever I was small, it was embarrassing. I wanted to lie about it to my friends. I remember being in like kindergarten and I would be like, my dad and my mom at home and my 18 siblings and we all love each other so much. Like, and I would just tell people these big elaborate stories about my big happy family. But probably after I lost my dad and as I got bigger, I realized that people thought that he was a bad person whenever they heard that he was an addict and that he was in prison. And I wanted to help.
When he came out, he was a completely different person. I don't know what happened. We didn't talk about it. But he was doing better. And I had hope that he was doing so much better that he'd get off heroin. But he really never did.
I grew up a little bit of everywhere along the east or Midwest, I guess we would say. So everywhere along the Midwest. I've lived in Indiana, Kentucky, and South Carolina. I was born in the hills of Kentucky. We lived there for just a wee little bit before coming to Indiana until I was 6. And then we moved to South Carolina. So journeyed down south, and we lived there till I was 15. And then journeyed basically back here to Indiana, and we've been here since. I met Bill in the winter of 2012. He got a job at Kingfish where I worked. And first thing I noticed, I was like, he is the most professional looking person I've ever walked into the building and asked for a server job. So I thought that was odd. But the other thing is Bill was 6'6" with a head full of silver hair. You couldn't miss him in the biggest crowd there ever was. And so from the second he walked in that building, I saw him and we were all like, we immediately joked and said, he's got to be an undercover cop trying to get a job as a server because nobody looks like that's going to be a server, right? But he was always someone who wanted to catch people's attention. And I purposely didn't give him that attention because I thought it was pompous. So he would send me little letters through the window or try to get my attention. And I probably didn't feed into it until Easter of 2013. And Easter of 2013, he showed up with the biggest Easter basket I've ever seen and gifted it to me. And so somebody gives you a big basket full of candy, you pay attention. So from that point on, we started interacting and getting to know each other. And it kind of just formed this new bond. The first time where there was an interaction like a date type thing, we were at Kingfish and he had asked if I wanted to take a break with him and split a brownie a la mode. So we went back there and I made us a hot fudge brownie and threw some ice cream on it. And so we sat on the dock of Kingfish and we ate a hot fudge brownie. Pretty early on, I loved him as a human. Now, that didn't necessarily mean at that point yet there was a romantic love, but there was a love of this bright person that he was. He captured a room easily. He shared fun stories. He made people laugh. And I love that about people. I love the way we can interact together. And people that add extra to an environment always are able to catch my eye. And so at that moment, I know I loved him as a person. And full disclosure, being vulnerable, I was pregnant with his son probably after March, April, whenever that Easter was that we were talking about. But I was pregnant by July, and that was a really hard thing for me because I didn't really know who Bill was at that time. I definitely wasn't ready for another child. There was a lot of heaviness over that. And like I said, we still weren't even at the point to know each other enough to be like, did we want to live together? Did we want to raise this child as just co-parents or as partners? And so I can say the first time I knew I really loved Bill is the excitement that came from him every time he talked about our child. We could be in the middle of Kroger, standing in line around strangers, and he would look at someone else and be like, do you know what? She's pregnant with my baby. And Lord, I would be so embarrassed. You got this man 6'6", pulling strangers aside, pointing to me, being like, she's pregnant with my baby. I'm like, you can't just talk to strangers like that. But he was so excited for life, and he was so proud of what we were bringing into the world. It was impossible not to just absolutely fall in love.
Oh, well, I heard about Bill before I met him. And I had mixed feelings because I knew Amanda was coming out of a bad relationship. And I felt that she was vulnerable. And I was wary of a new relationship that early. I was afraid somebody was taking advantage of her. So when I first met Bill, I was a little blown away. I was with Amanda. We were looking for dresses because I was getting married and she was going to officiate. So we were looking for something. And I hear this booming voice and I look up and here's this giant running through the store towards us. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, there's a crazy man in the store. Who is this? And he came over and introduced himself and he gave me a hug. And I'm like, what is, I don't know who this is. And so it was kind of a strange introduction to him. But as I got to know him further, I realized that's kind of a typical introduction when it came to Bill. Now, even after that introduction, it did take me a little while to warm up to him because I'm very protective of what's mine. And once I embrace you into my family, you're mine. So I was worried about how things were going to go in life in general. I had suspicions about what might or might not be going on with him because unfortunately I do have history with addicts. Was married to one before. I don't accuse people of things. I just kind of keep an eye out. And he and I had a few discussions about, be good to my daughter because I don't care how big you are. You'll have to deal with me if you're not. But I warmed up to him really quick because there's no way you couldn't. Bill was so full of life and just, he filled everything when he was there. He'd walk in the house the very first time he walked in my house, he was asking what I had sweet, what I had to eat. He would fall asleep on my couch. He would ask if there was anything we needed done. He embraced my mother and my pop with open arms and would help them with anything they needed done. And he just adopted Hope and Daisy like he'd given birth to them. Those were his children just as well as Sophia was.
And so the first thing he gave me was a promise ring on my birthday that year. It was a little ruby that he had gotten, and it's the first thing he said in his entire life he had ever paid off himself. He had went to a local jeweler, and every Friday when he would get, good server money, he would go down there and make a payment on it. And it was the sweetest, tiniest little ring, and he gave it to me on my birthday. And it was kind of a promise ring. He goes, I promise we're going to spend our lives together. And then Christmas of that same year, so it would have been Christmas 2013, this was before Liam was born, he gifted me with a ring that he had gotten from his mother. And he says, I can't go get you something big on my own, but this is something beautiful that meant something to my mom and it means something to me. And so he did the classic. He wrapped a little box into a bigger box, into a bigger box, into a bigger box. So I probably spent about 20 minutes unwrapping boxes until I got to that ring. And he was so excited. He wanted to open that box probably more than I did. He just couldn't wait for me to get it out there. And was with all the pride in the world, it was, I want you to be my wife and I hope we can spend together forever. It was really a little bit of time before I realized that there was some substance disorders. In my past, I had been around some individuals that had had some alcohol abuse issues, but I'd never really experienced any drug abuse or been around anybody that exhibited symptoms. I didn't know what to look for or what to know. But I remember really early on in our relationship, there's a time he had gotten ill. I had been told he had passed out in a store, ended up in the hospital, and he didn't tell me about any of that till afterwards. And I always thought that was really weird. He said, no, I called my mom. My mom came out. She made sure I was good. Everything was fine. Later to find out that was actually an overdose. It was something that had happened. He had begged his mom not to tell me because he just wasn't ready to share that part of his life with me yet. But it did kind of spark this idea in my head of there's something I don't know. And then I can remember he was applying to go to college and he wanted to and I was like, well, you should get some grants. You should get some funding. And we had to have that first conversation of, I'm not eligible for those types of things because of the things I've been through in my past. So it was the first time he opened up about it, but he opened up about it like it was so far in his past that it wasn't even something to almost even be mentioned. It was just, you should know. Again, I didn't know that there had been a slight overdose a few months prior. And I didn't know that this had been an ongoing struggle since, he was 18 years old. So, and then I can remember the first time that it became an issue with our household. Again, call it ignorance, call it naivety, whatever you would like. He had gotten arrested. And that's the first time I really had to confront the idea there's something going on that I don't know about. And what it was, he got arrested for theft. And you'll find this common. A lot of people, when they have that addiction issues and you see a lot of charges that are around possession, there's also a lot of theft. Never stole from our home, never took anything that was important to us or stole money that we had for rent, but petty things from stores, things he could sell off, things he could trade back for gift cards. And he had started this kind of bad habit of doing that because he didn't want to spend our money. And so that landed him in jail. And that was that first time he really had to come clean with, this is who I am. This is what I'm suffering with. How are you going to be here? And at that time, we had a son. I can even remember back to when I was giving birth to Liam. There was a couple times he disappeared. He almost missed the actual part of Liam coming out. And he said, I was on a cigarette break. And I always thought that was so strange, and now to come back, he was using during that time. I just wasn't aware. If it changed it in any way, once I realized this, it changed it to me feeling more of, I had to be a caretaker now. I can remember even at one point brag and be like, man, he came from practically, the bottom of the barrel. There was times he was homeless, and he had to come back from these substance abuse issues. And now he was in college, had his own place, keeping his job up. So there was a lot of pride in knowing he could overcome these things. And then it turned into this idea of having to convince myself there was nothing else he was hiding, having to do a little bit more research to understand what substance abuse was and how that could be affected in our house. And then there was a lot of, again, just being so unknowledgeable about the situations that I thought, well, if he just loves us enough and just wants to quit, he can quit. So I said, if we just pour as much love into him as we can, and we just provide him with the most beautiful life that we can, there's no need for him to use, right? So that's how it changed. We just worked even harder to be like, you're loved, you're here, this environment is your environment, and, we want you to know you don't have to turn to a substance for happiness because we're here. We had no idea that wasn't related. We had no idea that people don't turn to the substance because they're not happy in life, that there really is that core of addiction. So at the times where he would start using again, we would always know that Bill was using because he was not present in our lives. When Bill was sober, he was present for anything and everything he could be. If there was going to Sophia's school to have muffins with her for Dad's and Daughter's Muffins Day, if there was playing with Liam on the floor with toys, going to watch Daisy dance, trying to teach Hope how to drive, because he was the only one that had the patience to do that. He was so present in our lives. But when he was using, he didn't want us to see that, and he would disappear. And there were times he'd be gone for 2 or 3 weeks, and we had no idea where he was. There was a lot of anxiety involved in that. Calling hospitals, calling prisons, chasing down. It felt like chasing down a ghost because he didn't want to be found. And if he didn't want to be found, he wasn't going to be. Later in life, I would have those discussions with his mom and come to find out that was a common thing. And I'm sure if she was able to tell the story, she would. But I remember her saying he was out of town quite far, like a couple states away. And he was tracked down by a state trooper. And he said, listen, you better call your mom right now because she's looking for you. So he was an adult, so he couldn't really be reported as like a runaway kid or anything. But this cop in another state away said, your mom's looking for you and you better call her right now. So that's just the persistence that people that loved him in his life had to continue with, because he knew that what he was going through was not something, it wasn't something he was proud of. It wasn't something that he wanted us to have to live through either. So he would just try to take himself away from the situation, just away from us.
I saw them as a family and they were happy. There were rough times. When he was in jail, that was rough. When the car was wrecked, that was rough. And there were times Amanda and I argued. You know, maybe you don't need to be in a situation with somebody who's addicted, because I've been there. It's not fun. And this is something that the kids are going to see. And it's not something that you want them to be around. But she stood up for him because she loved him. And even when I don't agree with what she says or what she wants to do, I'm going to stand up for her. So I was there. And I watched him blossom with her. Even when he would fail with her and the kids, he was better. He wanted to be better. He started going to church with us. He wanted to be a part of that. He wanted to help out with everything in the church. He was so excited about going to church camp with the kids. Hope and Tyler were so against everything. And Tyler is a handful, so is Hope. But they could relate to him. And even Tyler's friends, everybody who met Bill gravitated toward him because they just wanted to be around him because he was so infectious. He was happy when he wasn't using and he wasn't caught in this trap and this demonic evil that gets wrapped up with this, that he was wonderful.
When he met Amanda, she was the love of his life. He absolutely loved her with every part of his being. And he had a big heart. He loved people. He loved people. He made the best that he could out of everything. But one time, Amanda told me that he was sitting on the back porch when he got up with a cigarette and a cup of coffee. And he was crying when she went out there. And he told her that he didn't want his children to go through anything.
You know, along this substance abuse and healing journey, we had every conversation you could imagine. There were the passionate ones where it was, I am here for you through anything. You know, I remember it was probably 3 or 4 months in. He looked at me one day and he said, you're going to live forever. And I was like, there's no way. He goes, no, ma'am, you're going to live forever. He goes, and I'm not going to live forever. But just know, when you get to heaven, I'll be the first person waiting there for you. And at the time when he said that, it seemed so silly, right? Because we were in our 30s. Who talks about death? You know, and it seemed like this silly comment to even have. And so I can remember throughout those times and the conversations we would have, there would be passionate ones like that, like, we are going to be in here till we're old, so you have to take care of yourself. Yeah. Then there was angry conversations. How can you do this to us? There were these times where I didn't understand. Some of these times where I was like, just stop. You were loved by so many people. How can you do this? There were sad conversations. You know, in the conversations we would have during these times, whether he was sober or whether he was in the midst of a bout of abuse of the substance, they would range in emotion. The ones I think back on the most that I wish I could take back were a lot of those angry ones. Because if someone's sick with cancer, you don't scream at them for having cancer. You don't blame them for having cancer. And I can remember many times I did that. And it was a lack of knowledge. It was the feelings that I had inside of me. It was watching my kids suffer because they were stuck in this situation. Watching his mom, watching my family suffer because of the pain I was being put through. That anger would come through to him. Sometimes it was these, how can we help you?
He told me one time, he said, Mom, I know that the only reason I'm alive is because you pray for me. And he said, please quit praying for me because I don't want to be here anymore. And I told him, I said, that is never going to happen. Never going to happen.
When I got the call from Tyler on that last night, I was devastated because he told me, he said, Mom, something's wrong. We can't wake up Bill. I said, I'm on my way. By the time I got here, they had already taken Bill away.
In your life, you have those core memories. And I will live through that day many, many times in my life. So the last day Bill was alive, a couple weeks prior, it actually been a couple months prior, let me rephrase it. A couple months prior, Bill had been in a car accident in my car. It was someone else's fault. And he was, after being in the car accident, he ended up using again, went back to jail, was in jail for 3 weeks. He had gotten out that Wednesday before. So it'd been just a week that he'd been out of jail. He ended up being able to go pick up a settlement he had gotten from that wreck. It was $4,000. And I remember being terrified of Bill having $4,000 in his pocket. I mean, I don't think I can remember a time that we were together where he had more than $40 in his pocket at a time that I knew of, because he knew that any immense amount of money, that's just what he tended to do, is turn to substances. And so the last day Bill was alive, he had a pocket full of money. I went to work. He asked if he could use my car and take me to work. So I let him take me to work. He used my car all day, came and picked me up from work. He said, I want to go get a PlayStation 4. I tracked one down. I found a used one. So he went and picked up the PlayStation 4. And then he did something that I will never, ever forget and forever be thankful for. He called his mom. So him and his mom, they're both feisty. And they always wanted to let the other person say sorry first, right? And so they were in a little bit of a disagreement, and they were stubborn, just waiting for that first phone call. And he said, I'm going to call my mama. And so we were going to go out of town that weekend for a dance competition. He goes, I'm going to call my mama. I'm going to make sure we can get Sophia to take with us. And he picked up his phone and he called his mom. And that conversation with his mom was so pleasant. I love you. You know, I'm sorry for these things. I'm thankful that we're all in each other's lives. You know, can we get Sophia? Just an everyday happy conversation. And after he got off the phone with his mom, we picked Liam up from daycare. And we had this conversation where he looked over me and he looked me in the eye and he goes, I just want you to know you're the strongest person I've ever known. And I started laughing and I was like, I don't even know why you're saying that or where you get it from. He goes, I just want you to know that it doesn't matter who's in your life, who isn't in your life. You are the strongest person that I've ever known. And just remember that. And I kind of teared up a little bit and I was like, stop it. Don't talk about those things. Just thank you. And then we did all the rest of the chores. We went and picked up Daisy from dance. We went and picked up the teenagers from church because it was a Wednesday. So they were at church that day. Went and got dinner and came home. Those next couple hours, they stand out pretty extreme. So we sat down and we had a meal. Bill sat on the front porch convincing the teenagers to go to church camp. And these at the time were my oldest, Hope, and my brother. And the two of them were not interested in traveling away from home or being at a church camp necessarily for a week. But Bill said, no, it's going to be the best thing you've ever done. I'm going to volunteer. I want to go with you all. Let's do this. Okay. And so they agreed, fine, we'll do church camp. He came in here, got the littles down to bed, sat down with my brother to play some video games. And I gave him a kiss, told him to hurry to bed because I needed him to come in there and cuddle with me, and went to sleep. Next thing I remember, my brother was banging on my door, waking me up. Sissy, Bill's in the bathroom. He's been in there a long time and he won't answer. Can you come check on him? Okay. So I came and I knocked on the door. He didn't answer. So I opened the door. He's sitting on the toilet, but he's passed out asleep. Now, let me stop there to say Bill is someone who could sleep anywhere at any time for any amount of time. He could fall asleep in the middle of a conversation with you, using or not using. He could fall asleep in the middle of a conversation. So I thought it was hilarious. I was like, he's not falling asleep on the toilet, right? Try to shake him a little bit. Keep in mind at this time, I had no idea he was using again. He had only been out of jail for a week. He had been with me the majority of the time. I had no clue there was still using going on. And so at that point, I tried to wake him up and I couldn't. So I knew there was something odd, but I wasn't yet really worried. So my brother and I And it took both of us quite a bit of work. We drug Bill into my room to put him to bed. So at that time, I felt weird inside, but I didn't know what was going on. And Tyler was like, "You sure he's okay?" We joked Bill had false teeth, and he was snoring extremely loudly during this whole thing. And so we joked, and Tyler was like, "You got to take his teeth out of his mouth. He can't sleep with his teeth in." And I was like, "I'm not reaching in his mouth and taking them out." So this went on. Like, we were joking during this time. Couldn't pick him up and put him in bed. So we made him a little pallet on the floor, and we laid him down to go to sleep. My brother came back in here to play video games. I crawled back in bed and went to sleep. His snoring would put me to sleep. It was like my white noise. You know, I'd slept with him for so long. The snoring was like having a fan on or a noise machine, something like that. So what woke me up was the silence in the room. I woke up, and it was probably about 2 hours after we brought him back into the room. It was the quietest I've ever heard this house. And immediately I dove down to the floor and realized he wasn't breathing. So in those moments, I came out the door. I told Tyler, I was like, "Call mom," because I didn't know what else to do. And I called 911. So my brother called my mom. I can't tell you to this day who got here first. I don't know if my mom got here first, if the ambulance got here first. I know that they got here and they were asking me all these questions about what was happening. They were administering Narcan and all the breathing things that you can imagine. They were doing all these things and asking me questions, and I was confused. I've got kids still asleep in the house. This was probably 3 or maybe like 4 or 5 in the morning. I had kids still asleep in the house that had school the next day. Police walking around. They said, "Do you think it's an overdose?" And at that point I was like, "Yeah, I do." So they said, "Do you think there's drugs in the house?" I don't know. The police searched the house to see if they could find any drugs to make sure the house was clean of it. They took Bill off in an ambulance. And I remember just screaming, "Is he okay? Is he okay?" And the guy looked at me and said, "We've got him breathing again, but we don't know." So my mom got here. We went to the hospital. And I don't know who called who or how it got there. I remember his mom showing up. I remember his sister showing up. And when we got to the hospital, they took us to a room. And I'm very familiar with this hospital. It's a hospital my mom had worked at. And I'm a clumsy kid, and my kids are clumsy. We've been in and out of hospitals, right? So they took me to a room I'd never been in, a room I didn't even know was there. And I kind of knew at that moment that there was something wasn't right. And his mom came, his sister came, and my mom was there. We're all in the room together. And they came in and they looked at us and they was like, "We're sorry, there's nothing else we can do." And this stands out to me because I can remember saying, "No, he's bigger than normal people. You got to go back in there and you got to keep trying, because whatever you would have to do to keep a normal person alive, you got to do double to keep Bill alive, because he's bigger and you got to do it." And I can remember my sea of support system just scooping me up and telling me, like, calming me down basically, and being like, "It's okay." Pulling me back. I remember his sister saying somebody's got to do something to help her calm down. And from that point on, the next couple days were a whirlwind. Just such a whirlwind. And I kept going back to all the things of that day, and I was like, man, he reached out to his mom. He played with every one of the kids individually. He had these intense conversations. It was like one of the best days we'd ever had. And I just couldn't believe that's how it ended. And it seemed like a fairy tale. Something you had seen on a movie, not something you just lived through.
When I got the call from Tyler on that last night, I was devastated because he told me, he said, "Mom, something's wrong. We can't wake up Bill." I said, "I'm on my way." By the time I got here, they had already taken Bill away. And Tyler stayed with the kids, and I took Amanda to the hospital. I was so pissed off because this wasn't supposed to happen.
So for 18 years, he had a monkey on his back, and he couldn't get rid of it. And I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. I had to go to church praying for it. God took him because that's the only way he would ever be free.
You know, we'd had that visit at church when he'd taken the water up. I was so proud of him. Everybody at church was proud of him. He'd turned a corner as far as we were all concerned. He was doing so well. When we walked in the hospital and they guided us to that room, I will never forget my daughter saying, "Mommy, this isn't a good room. I don't want to be in here." So I called Lisa to let her know that she needed to come to the hospital. And I've seen my daughter through a lot of things. But I will never forget that night. I will never forget seeing my daughter completely break down. And begging me to make it better, to make him okay, and pleading with the doctors to fix it. And knowing there was nothing anybody could do. And the doctor walked in there that night and told us that Bill made number 30. 30 people in that month that had died because of fentanyl. Because of some, excuse my language, but some asshole who just thinks it's some big kick to lace something with this. Everybody thinks that drug abuse and drug problems are a street problem. Oh, that's a problem for people who don't have anything better to do, or they just want to party all the time. I've been in medicine for 40 years, and I can guarantee you that's a lie. I've seen people from every walk of life come through our hospital, overdosing, or who've had their life completely changed by somebody in their family with addiction. You can look at anybody. I don't care what they look like. I don't care how well they dress. I don't care how articulate they are. I don't care how much money they have. And they could be an addict. And people think addiction is just street drugs. It's not. People can get addicted to any kind of drug. You know, we have prescription drugs all the time. People have prescription drugs, and a lot of teenagers get into that stuff at home. Teenagers die from getting into that. We have to do something about this.
Oh, my biggest memory. Oh, he gave me a lot because he was always doing something. When we get together as a family with my mom, my dad, and my sister, we have so many stories of things that we couldn't believe he did or didn't do or whatever. But he was just such a lover. He really was. When he was a little baby, he was the sweetest little baby you could ever imagine. And, you know, there was just so many things that I could say. You know, I was so proud of him when he had his kids, as how proud he was of them and how wonderful he loved his life. And I was very thankful for that.
Bill gives a lot of memories, but I had to laugh when I was listening to Lisa's story because one of my biggest memories was not long before we lost Bill. We were at a restaurant of all places, but you know, it didn't matter to him where anyone was. He came over, and for the first time ever, he sat in my lap. And I was like, okay, it's official. This is my son. And that just cemented a relationship and a love that I knew we were already sharing finally. And I feel like it would have blossomed to so much more. And I felt like it was cut short, but I'll always remember him plopping in my lap like that.
I have a lot of good memories. But one of my favorites, he had probably not been out of prison for very long at this time, and he was living in a trailer, and with some guy. I don't even know who he was. He rode a scooter to work. But my grandma had brought me over to him this day, and like, I would just hang out with him for a little bit, and she would stay in the area, like, whatever, we would just have a little time, and he was like, "We're gonna walk to the park, and we're gonna eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and then we're gonna play at the park for however long you want." And I was so excited until we walk to the park, and we get there, and it starts pouring rain. Like, it is just a downpour, like, there's no way we're ever gonna get to play. And so he's calling every person that he knows to come take us home. Like, he is not gonna make me walk home in the rain, and he has called every last person, and I don't know why he didn't call his mom. Like, I think that he just was embarrassed, and so finally somebody picked us up and took us back to his house, and, he made me a peanut butter and jelly. We always ate peanut butter and jelly, and then he taught me how to tie my shoes. And that was one of the very few things that he did that, like, a normal parent does, is, like, he taught me how to tie my shoes, and I think that's one of my best days I ever had with him.
You know, Bill gave us so many good memories that to pinpoint one is almost impossible. So I'm going to make it the most personal, individual memory that I possibly can for me and who I am with Bill. And then, because that's the gift with Bill, is that he was such a big personality that it's impossible to remember a situation he was in and not remember how he made you feel. But I'm a concert junkie. If there's a concert in town or a festival, you better bet I'm going to try to get tickets to it. And Bill was very much the same way. But I stand about 5'3". And so I don't often get a good view, especially if it's a general admission crowd and you're standing. But Louder Than Life 2016, we go to all the Louder Than Lives. And in 2016, we went and Leonard Skinner was there. And he let me sit on his shoulders the entire Leonard Skinner set. And when Simple Man came on, he sang the entire song as loud and as proud as you could while holding up a lighter. And there was something about being on top of somebody's shoulders. He was 6'6", and I could see over the whole entire crowd. And I could hear his voice above everything. That stands with me. Oh my goodness. That sticks with me on a weekly basis. I think about that moment. I felt like a queen on top of her castle, or on top of, like, sitting on her knight's shoulders, protected and safe. And even though I was in a crowd of thousands of people, it was like nobody else existed than me and him in that moment. Listening to him sing and just feeling like we were together stands out so much. And then I was never the biggest Leonard Skinner fan. Everybody loves Leonard Skinner, right? But now I really listened to the lyrics of that song. I heard them for the first time. I understood them for the first time. And now every time I hear that song, I think about the day when I'm going to gift it to my son, where I'm going to tell him, listen to this. And I want you to hear your dad in those words, because there's so much to be said in that I don't think Bill will ever get to say to his kids, that I think every kid or parent should hear. And so that's probably my best memory of Bill, is sitting what felt like on top of a tower, listening to him sing at the top of his lungs. It was nighttime. All you could see is the lights from the stage, and it was magical.
Not knowing sooner, not knowing what to do. I went to school for that, but you can't always help your own person.
But if I can say my biggest regret when it comes to Bill, it's going to be twofold. Number one is not being more knowledgeable over what he was experiencing. A lot of times I wanted to ignore the addiction. Instead of taking the time to educate myself on what I could do to be a better partner with someone dealing with that, instead of equipping myself with some of the tools that are available today that could prevent overdose, or helping him turn to substances that some people have used to get off of that. I was very against some of the alternative substances that they prescribe these days because I didn't know. Ignorance led to judgment over these products. And so my biggest regret is being angry over his addiction and ill prepared to be a partner with somebody that was struggling with it.
My biggest regret is that I didn't have more time with him.
I didn't value my time with my dad enough at all, which I was little, and I obviously never thought that I would have to look back on just these few little memories, but I just wish that I would have taken every last opportunity to be with him, and that I would have gone to see him every weekend, and that I would have been with him as much as physically possible, and I didn't do that because I was little and I wanted to do what was fun. But that's definitely my biggest regret.
You know, I can't share Bill's story without sharing one very important story from Bill's last week alive. So we attend church regularly, one community church, and it's been a part of our family for years and years and years and years. And Bill was always a little adverse to some churches because there's a lot of judgment that comes in that, but he loved our church and dove right in. And the last Sunday that we attend church service together, we had a guest preacher, and we were just sitting in the pew listening to the preacher, and the preacher was having a little bit of a hard time, coughing, choking up a little bit. It's like he had something stuck in his throat. Well, midway through the service, Bill gets up and just leaves. This was not something odd. Bill was a wanderer. Sometimes he would just get up and walk away, and you wouldn't see him again for hours or days. And sometimes he would just pop right back up. So I didn't think anything of it when he walked away. But the next thing you know, Bill enters back into the sanctuary, goes up to the front, and walks right up on the stage in the middle of the preacher preaching and hands him a glass of water. I was so embarrassed in those moments. It was kind, it was beautiful, but I was so embarrassed. Who interrupts the church service in the middle of the church, walks on stage, and hands the preacher a glass of water, right? No social awareness whatsoever, no social awareness. Hands the preacher the glass of water. We all kind of giggled in the church, and he came and sat back down. That was Sunday. Bill passed away that Wednesday evening. 2 weeks go by, I couldn't go back to church. I was just a little distraught. It was a lot of going through. So 2 weeks later, I go back to the church, and when I walk up, this preacher meets me at the door like he's been waiting to see me his whole life. And he says, "Amanda, I've been needing to reach out to you. I need to talk to you." He goes, "Since the moment Bill passed, I've had the same verse come across my path like 5 or 6 different times. And that verse was Matthew 10:42. And this, to this day, was another godsend, because that verse, and it's not going to be verbatim for all of those Bible scholars out there, but the gist of it says, "Whoever gives a glass of water to my least of my followers will forever receive their reward." And I struggled a lot. I remember the first thing I asked my preacher when Bill passed away, is he going to have to go to hell? Is he going to be punished because he died like this? My preacher said, "No, Amanda, it's not the way it works. I just know it isn't." And so for that guest preacher, for the moment he saw me, to come to me and say, "If even the least of my follower, or even anyone who gives a glass of water to even the least of my followers shall forever receive his reward." Knowing that Bill had just thrust that glass of water to that preacher not even a week before, will stick with me in my heart forever. It was God saying, "He's here with me. It's okay."